I want to talk about how to use shading using light logic to make your shading more organized, faster, and easier. So I'm going to look at this cast of my head, and when I'm looking at an object and think about where the light is coming from, and in my case it's coming from the top left. And the object is pretty much like a big egg shape, so I'm going to first draw a simplified version of it. So I would say it's like an egg or a potato. And when I look at the coarse shadow, I notice that it's coming through pretty much in the center. And by coarse shadow, I mean where the light area of the object, or the area of the object affected by the light, joins with its shadow. So it comes around something like this and going around the chin over here. So that's pretty much my object and the shadow. And I can see that there's a cast shadow goes pretty straight across the neck this way, and in the back it's casting onto the wall. There's a neck in here, and I see that cast shadow is on the wall over there. I can simply suggest the light just by drawing that major inner corner where the light stops and the shadow begins. And if I make that inner corner a little bit softer by creating a few more lines, especially in the areas that are really soft in its transition, very gradual, then what I'm actually doing is I'm describing the whole area of the turning of the form. And by drawing this line a little bit lighter, by drawing the shadow lines a little bit darker, by making them a little bit sharper, I already suggest the lighting. But I can throw in a little bit of shading in there, and in this case I'm just going to try to find the flat side of my pencil. So I'm drawing with the side, and I'm just going to create even crosshatch marks. I'm going to go over the cast shadow also, and fill it in. It will make it even easier for us to see what's light, what's shadow. It's closer to the way that we're seeing things in life. But we don't need to copy everything that we're seeing. What I'm trying to do is just to break it down into separate elements. So in this case we got the light area, we got the shadow, which is the form shadow and the cast shadow, and we have the coarse shadow that comes through the form. The coarse shadow is usually a little bit darker because there's no light that's affecting it. It's right at the edge of the form where the light, the main light source, is no longer affected, and there's no secondary light that bounces back, that creates a reflected light, is affecting that edge either, because this edge is more or less perpendicular to the light source and to the reflected light going back. So for most part, usually the coarse shadow is actually a fairly wide area, and you can see it on the image. It is maybe as wide as this whole area right here. And by darkening that whole area, you can see that the rest of it starts to look a little bit more like a reflected light. Now you can also notice that in the areas like underneath the head, we have very clear reflected light underneath the jaw, but then it gets a little bit darker comparing to that reflected light where the casting shadow is, or the cast shadow is dropping over the neck. I should probably draw the rest of this object like this, just to make it more like my reference. So this is pretty much the simplification of that head. I didn't draw the nose, and there are many other things that are included in this light logic. But this is the starting point. I want to go over and name all of the elements of the light. So if we have a light source, we're going to have the lightest area probably in just a few parts of the face. Maybe a part of the forehead that's going to catch a little bit of reflected light. In this case, I think my lightest light is really around the eyeball right here. And then next to that lightest light, which we call a highlight, we're going to get all kinds of light and middle light or middle tone areas. And as they get closer towards the shadow, they start getting a little bit darker and they turn into what's called halftone. So we got halftone, we got middle tone, and we got some light. Alright, so I named highlight, light, middle tone, halftone. There might be slightly different alterations to these names, but that's basically the lightest light values to the middle light values to halftone. The halftone is called that way is because it's already so close to the shadow that part of it is shadow, but it's still being affected by the light. It's the texture of the pores or the object, the scratch marks. They have high points that catch the light, and then they have little divots that are actually in the shadow, and they're casting little shadows. But that area is still being affected by the light. That's why it still belongs to the whole area of the light versus the shadow, and it will be lighter than anything inside the shadow, even the reflected light. And that's the kind of the first rule that I'd like you to remember is that middle tones or half tones will always be lighter than anything inside the shadow. So middle tones are lighter than the reflected lights. And that's what we want to describe in there. So I want to now find all of these values or the gradations of values in the rest of the image. So it will go from lighter to darker to fairly dark halftones over here. And you will see that it does that throughout the whole form in here, softening that transition, creating a gradation of lighter to darker, and creating this more gradual shading, therefore. I probably need to bring in a little bit more shadow in here. And if we look at the cast shadow in the back, you will also notice that in here the cast shadow is a little bit darker. So instead of going with this cross-hatching that went all the way across, I'm going to change the direction a little bit and create a second layer that makes this a little bit darker, but then as it goes gradually down, it gets lighter. You can see that by the time it gets to the ear is actually darker than the cast shadow behind it. So we have a lot of variations of values. The reason why the cast shadow is darker here is because this object is really close to the wall and it's blocking all the bounced light and the secondary light around the room, or what's called an ambient light, from affecting this area. But by the time the shadow gets to around here, there's a lot more of these secondary lights in the room that are affecting this. So it does get fairly light around here. And it creates a beautiful transition from darker to lighter, from darker to lighter, from lighter to darker. That suggests turning of the form. Alright, so let me do a quick drawing over here on the larger scale, going over some of the things that we talked about before. So I'm going to look at my head here, draw a light line for the front of the face, think about what's the top level and angle of the head is as it comes to the back. I'm thinking already about the width comparing to the height and how it transitions into the neck. Where is the jaw line? Here I actually draw it with the cast shadow. And I'm going to suggest the roundness of the throat here. Here's my jaw. Here's the temple bone. This is wider, this is narrower. I got to get the exact thickness of it. And I want to think about the arc of the brow to join the two brows together. And looking at this angle, it's pretty much a vertical, and this is slightly more diagonal. Together they're creating this arc this way. Now from the brow line to the chin, about halfway still, maybe a little bit higher, is the base of the nose. And if I look at the tip of the nose, it's slightly to the left of the eyebrow. It's right here, and I can create an arc for the base of the nose. I'm thinking how they are connected gesturally this way, and that allows me to then think about that form, volume of the nose. You can see this is the beginning of the whale's tail, and it really is also arcing around this way. And as I bring the eye socket down, I want to look how it comes to the cheekbone and where that cheekbone is going. It's going kind of towards the nose in there. And I'm blocking in this very large area of the eye socket. And if you look, the whale's tail has a base in here that's a little bit darker, and then from there we have eye bags or the top of the sinus pads coming around this way, and it starts to describe the mouth barrel and the chin. So all of these sub-forms, smaller forms. Here's the bottom of the cheekbone, the top of the cheekbone, and the big form of the jaw. I'm going to add the ear. Ear is more in the back. And pretty much got my head, major parts of the head blocked in. If I bring the center line to the base of the nose and think about the upper lip plane up in here, and I can show how the center line travels around these forms, goes in, comes to the chin, and goes around the chin. And that will help me to make the roundness of the mouth. We're thinking of the form, so it's nice to think about the volumes from the start. So now that we set up the areas where things will be, maybe suggest the eye, this cheekbone. Now I can start thinking about the core shadow, or terminator line, or shadow edge as I often call it. So I'm going to find where it travels, and sometimes it helps me to think from one area to the other, so I kind of try to start from the top and then move down. That way I don't forget or skip something. So I'm gonna try to do that in this case. So I'm gonna think about the roundness of this forehead, and I'll see that the light is coming from the left. I see very subtle, soft coarse shadow coming around this way, and it starts to turn around like so. I'm using several lines to keep it soft, but when it gets to the temple bone, it gets a little bit sharper and a little bit darker. So then here it goes around the cheekbone. It gets a little bit softer because it's the whole plane that's kind of where that line is. There's no sharp edge. It gets a little bit sharper again up around this area. And notice that by me drawing it a little bit darker than the lines around, that edge really does come forward. And we want that to come forward, as it actually is the closest part to your eye, to my eye. Here I'm going to go around the chin. And the chin again is very round, very gradual, so I'm going to draw several lines to soften that transition in there. Now I want to look at the other shadows that I see. I see a cast shadow traveling across this way, across the sternmastoid muscle, and then it's like a cylindrical form on the side. Comes like this, and maybe a bit lower, and it's casting on the side over here. So we get something like that. The nose will have its own shadow. It's also blocking the light, so I want to look at, I'm going to simplify the nose into fairly simple sharp edge. It gets a little bit wider towards the tip of the nose, and it travels around this way. Cast shadow does show a little bit of a shape of the light right there, and the nostril is casting the shadow this way, goes over the roundness of the sinus pad. Here's the tip of the nose is casting a shadow over here. It's going to go up to the side. That's the cast shadow over here. So I'm going to now draw the cast shadow on the wall. And I want to quickly shade it in. There might be some little shadows in some areas, maybe this plane of the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid. That would be also in the shadow. So I want to quickly now shade it in, and I want to learn from my previous drawing that I could get even a little bit darker with it. So don't have to, but I think I want to try. And even though my pencil is pretty small, I think I was drawing this way a lot on the smaller drawing, but in this case I'm going to hold my pencil this way so I can really draw longer lines. I'm just going to flatten my, my pencil on the side over here, and I'm going to start creating an arbitrarily, whatever is more comfortable, diagonal cross hatching. I should say it's hatching, not cross hatching. And you go from one edge and you feather it out so it's easy to blend things in. So I'm just creating an even tone, but I try not to create a very abrupt stops like this, but rather feather it out. So I'm gonna then be able to I build the shadow, I build the area of the light. I did the same thing for the nose, and now I'm starting to block in the tones, trying to keep it fairly dark, not too light from the start. I need to have a fairly decent amount of value, otherwise it will be hard for me to do all the middle tones and half tones. So I need it to be fairly dark value. And I'm trying to give an even tone, somewhat arbitrary diagonal direction, and I'm also going from the inside of the head all the way into the cast shadow. So I'm just gonna fill this in to give it a sense of unity of that whole area having a lack of light. I'll try to do it quickly as one step, and I would like to take that as my first step to not chase after all of the light and dark variations of values within the shadows and the lights, and getting too caught up on trying to identify all of these more subtle small relationships. But instead I'm trying to just make it simple. I want to see the shape of shadow versus the shape of the light. And if you look, I also make really fast tone, and sometimes I go over the line, but it's very easy to then fix it up, and it's much better than trying to be very slow and precise on hitting the edges. There's something about having energetic lines that make the drawing seem more exciting, I guess. So this is just two tones. I'm not showing all the other elements of light in there. So now I want to look at my core shadow and think about it, that maybe it's not just a line. Maybe I need to really think about how far does it go. If you look at the bottom of the head, there is a reflected light in there that we see. You can see it how I blocked it in here. The reason why this seems to be light, it's the same value as this, but it's surrounded by two darks, the cast shadow and the core shadow. So I'm going to make the core shadow a little bit darker, just like in my reference. By the way, my reference is right there in front of me. So I'm just looking at it, but it looks more like what you see in the photograph up above. So in here we have a core shadow that's actually a whole area around the cheekbone. It's a wider area, so it's not just a line. If it was just a line, it would be too sharp of a corner, and we need it to be somewhat softer corner. Comes around like this, and on the bottom there's a cast shadow. So we have a cast shadow over here coming around all the way around this way, and that's gonna make it darker than the reflected light, and it has a sense of that plane of reflected light, facing the direction of the light, bouncing off of the neck back to the bottom of the head. And that's what allows us to think about the form a little bit more. The form in terms of which parts of the face are facing towards one light source and which ones are facing towards the reflected light source, and it makes it more of a structural form rather than flat two-dimensional shapes. So I'm gonna finish my core shadow. What do I see? I see quite a bit of the core shadow here. If you really think about it, what we're drawing here is these large areas of light, large areas of core shadow, and the area of reflected light. That is what this whole head is doing, actually. So we really need to show that. We need to show that there's a large area of the dark core shadow. It goes all the way around this way. Maybe the top of the head is what's getting some of reflected light coming off. Here's the ear. The ear is darker. So let's first simplify it into a large shape, a darker shape. And that alone gives us a better idea for the form than trying to work on the subtle small details in there. Here's dark cast shadow, and my head has actually got a lot darker because it's nighttime now than when I took the picture, but still the light logic is the same. And then I want to make the cast shadow darker right here. Again, slightly changing the direction of hatching. And I'm going to gradate it from darker to lighter as it goes down. But I want the ear to be significantly darker, the back of the head a little bit lighter, and here is the darkest core shadow on the wall. So it's not that one thing that's lighter than the other, it's depending on where the planes are catching all those lights and how they relate to the other values around it. But we're still thinking about the light logic, where the light is starting from, where it bounces back into the form. So we're doing it in the organized way. And here I'm going to do the same thing to the nose. We got dark core shadow, we got reflected light areas. Here the core shadow goes along the edge, bringing that edge towards us, along the nostril edge this way, and right away these dark values become a lot lighter. They start to glow. And then we get the cast shadow that is also fairly dark over here. And together they make this look like the reflected light. And we got something that we still didn't talk about, ambient occlusion inside the nostril. Those are the areas of the crevices where the light doesn't get into very easily, this ambient secondary light. Those are areas of ambient occlusion. The ambient light is limited in there. Okay, so now all I have left to do is just find my halftones, middle tones, light lights, and I will end up with some reflected lights. So I'm just going to quickly add some cross hatching. This is where you actually want to add those marks that you can actually see, the more textured surfaces, more directional marks, so we can really see and feel these specific planes. In the shadow, things can flatten out, but in the light, you want to see things a lot easier. I might be doing it a little bit exaggerated. Again, just like Jean-Baptiste Greuze was making those marks a little too harsh. And you can do it a lot finer than that. But if you can do it with harsh marks, that's not a bad thing, I think. As long as they follow the form, create a sense of the form. So I'm creating a lot of these transitional dark values as they're getting towards the coarse shadows. So let me find these planes up in here. There's some darker values over here. This whole area is dark. The side of the eyeball dark. We forgot to make these eyelids in the shadow. And by we, I mean I forgot. Here's the shadow, the thickness of the eyelid on the inside. And just that little detail allows us to sculpt that eye pretty much. Here's the eye bags right here. Now I don't have the other eye on this cast as closed, and I have just a little bit of the tone right here and the tone underneath the eyelid, and that's all that we need to describe that. We got a little bit darker value, middle tone value on that side of the lip, and a lot darker almost into the shadow on here and this side of the lip over here. All those little values and cross-hatching are sculpting these planes, individual planes, that allow us to see the form emerge. This middle tone, it's not really a shadow, but middle tone underneath the lower lip creates these planes. We got some muscles of the lower lip. We got the nods on the side of the corner of the mouth, just where the mustache would wrap around the mouth barrel. Getting pretty dark. That's half tones and partially shadows. And this is another sphere, so we're gonna have light areas, and we're gonna have a transition, very gradual gradation into halftones until it gets to the coarse shadow. But we don't want to lose that sense of coarse shadow. We want to be able to tell what is halftone, which still belongs to the light, and where the shadow begins. We want to be somewhat clear about showing the difference, because in the real life those things are quite different from each other. And the side of the Adam's apple, so we have this form, the side of it starts getting darker. Then there's another triangular form, and these are halftones. There's a dark groove, a line that comes down like this. Coarse shadow on the side of the sternomastoid in here. A pretty dark plane of the cast shadow. But on the back side, it gets a little bit of reflected light. And we get a lot of halftones, somewhat shadows up on this side. The edge is actually catching some shadows. I'm just drawing it a little bit higher. And then it's getting lighter on that side. So let me think about where I need to hit it again with a little bit more contrast. Maybe bring this edge a little bit forward. If I missed anything, you know, I have to look for those areas. I'm not trying to finish one area. I'm really trying to find relationship between all of the core shadows, all of the reflected lights, all of the middle tones. So I compare things that are similar to each other and trying to find the difference between them. And usually from this stage you just spend time revising the information and making it better. You can use the eraser and take some textures out and bring them back again if you need to make things a little bit clearer. Or if you don't like something, that's how you just build it up. But I'm hoping that this simplified approach to thinking about values in terms of light logic, how it relates to the light, how it relates to these specific terms as half-light, light, the highlight, I should say, light, middle tone, half tone, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, the ambient occlusions, the ambient light. If we understand what all of those areas are and we start looking for them in the actual real life situations, then we train our eye to not to just look for light and dark shapes, but rather see things in terms of how they're developed using light. And then you don't have to rely on copying the values the way they are. You can make a light drawing or you can make a dark drawing, it doesn't matter, because you're describing light relationships versus how the values appear. And your light becomes a little bit clearer. It becomes about expressing the form using light rather than trying to get a pattern or textures that might fall apart. They might not connect to the structure the way that the light logic explains it. Alright, so I hope this is helpful to you guys, and we will be talking about it more with the future exercises too. Good luck!